Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals 201. This is lesson 8, and today you will learn how to use JavaScript to script forms, because after all, this is one of the primary reasons why JavaScript was created to begin with, because way back in ye olden days, there was really no such thing as broadband. Well, there was, but if you had broadband, you were an internet service provider, so it's pretty fair to say that everyone had dial-up, and if you're not familiar with dial-up, it was an extremely slow form of communication. I mean, we're talking about 9600 baud modems, or 33.6 or 56K. 9600 was 9.6 kilobits per second. 33.6 was 33 kilobits per second. And then if you were really lucky, you could get 56K, which was 56 kilobits per second. So these are very slow speeds, and it made using the web an exercise of patience, especially when dealing with forms, because you could spend your time to fill out the form, click the submit button, and then wait 30 seconds only to be told that you entered something incorrectly. It was very frustrating. So when JavaScript came along, developers were able to validate some of the user inputs before the form was sent to the server. So while you don't want to validate everything using JavaScript, it at least allowed developers to check for certain things before the form was submitted to the server. So this is still something that's used today, and thus is why we are going to look at it today. So let's get started. Let's look at the HTML. It's very simple. We just have a form element inside of our page. It has an ID of the form. We can also specify the name attribute. So let's go ahead and add that as well, because that's typical of what you will find within an HTML document. And then the action is set to nothing, because we're not going to send this form to any server-side application. We're just going to work with the form as is. As far as JavaScript is concerned, we have our event utility. We will use that today to work with events. And then we have our script file, which doesn't have anything but an immediately invoked function. So let's first get this form object within our code, because there are some methods and an event that are used with the form object, and we are going to use the document.getElementById method to retrieve that element. Now we could actually use document.theForm, and this will retrieve the same form element object, but there's no guarantee that this is going to work in the future. This works now, but it might be deprecated in a future version of the DOM. So instead, we will just future-proof our code, and we will use the document.getElementById method, because that's always going to be there, at least for the foreseeable future. So let's just specify the form as the ID that we want to retrieve, and then this is going to get our form element object. When the user submits a form, it fires the form's submit event. This is an event that we can listen for, so let's use our event utility object, add event, and we first want to specify the form object. The submit event is what we want to handle, and then of course we have a function that we want to execute whenever that event fires. Now there might be some cases where we want to stop the form from being submitted. One of those cases would be if the user input invalid information within the form, which is once again, why we have JavaScript to perform user input validation. So if we are going through our validation routines and we find that the user didn't input some information exactly how we wanted it, we could prevent the form from being submitted by using our prevent default method. And there we go. There might be some other reason why you might want to prevent the form from being submitted, but the most common reason is for validation purposes. The form object has two methods. One of those is the submit method. This will submit the form, but it does not fire the submit event. The reason being because if you are calling the submit method, then you have the opportunity to perform whatever validation or whatever JavaScript code that you need to execute before the form is submitted. You can do that before you call the submit method. So that's why the submit method will not raise the submit event. The other method is reset. It resets the form, just like if you clicked on a reset button to reset the form. That's what the reset method does. The form object also has an elements property. This is one that we will not talk about today, but we will probably use it whenever we start talking about Ajax. The elements property is actually a collection of the elements inside of the form, and it's only the elements that are actual form controls. So if you have any divs or anything like that inside of the form, those are not going to be represented inside of the elements collection. But if you have any text input or checkboxes, radio buttons, anything like that, then those elements would be found inside of the elements collection. But once again, we will not talk about that today. We will more than likely see that in use whenever we talk about Ajax. Well, let's add some elements to our form so that we can talk about those instead of just the form object. Let's add a button, and we can do so in two ways. We can add the button using the button element, but we can also use the input element, which is probably the more widely used way. And all we have to do is set the type attribute to one of three values. The first is the submit. This will create a submit button, which will submit the form whenever it's clicked. It will also raise the submit event. The other is reset. That will reset the form whenever it is clicked. And then the third is just button. This is a normal button. So let's just go with that. Let's give it an ID of my button. And let's set its value to click me. So click me. We'll finish out that element. And let's go back to our JavaScript. Let's retrieve this button element, or this input element rather. And we can do so using the getElementById method, or we can use it or get it by going through the form. So let's create a variable first called button, and we will specify form, and then the name of the button, my button. So this is going to retrieve the my button input element, assign it to button so that we can use it within our code, and then let's set an event handler for it, because as it is right now, there's nothing occurring whenever we click the button. In fact, before we write any code, let's refresh the page, let's click the button, and we can see that nothing's happening. So let's write some code to do something when it's clicked. So let's add event, specify button. We want to handle the click event, and of course we want to execute a function. And inside of that function, let's just alert, you clicked me. It asked us to, so we might as well click it. So let's click it. We get the alert box that says you clicked me. As far as properties go, the input elements have some pretty straightforward properties. The first is the value property. It gets whatever is specified as the value attribute for that element. So let's first get the button object and then get its value. Now we could use the button object that we've already specified outside of our event handler, but I like to completely decouple our event handlers from any code outside of it. That way there's no dependency whatsoever. So let's get the event target. We'll create a variable called target. We will use the event utility.getTarget method, pass in the event object, and then we want to alert target value. This is going to display the value of click me. So let's go back to the browser, refresh. Whenever we click on the button, we will see an alert box that says click me. So that is the value of this input element. Another property is the type, and this gets the type attribute. So whenever we click this again, we will see the value of button inside of our alert window. There's another property called disabled, which disables or enables the button. So let's do target.disabled equals true. It's a Boolean value. And whenever you disable a button, it no longer can receive events. So whenever we click on the button, it's going to disable it. We can see that it is grayed out. And then we get the alert box that we got before, displaying the type of this input element. But whenever we click OK, we can no longer click on this button because it is disabled. It does not receive the click event again. So if you want to re-enable the button, you have to set the disabled property to false. That will enable the button. And as far as we are concerned, we aren't going to see much of a change because it's going to disable it and then re-enable it so quickly that we won't see it. But we can see the results in that we can continue to click on it because it has been enabled. Well, let's add some text to our form now. We can do this using the input element and setting its type to either text, password, that's password, or hidden. Hidden is a text box. It's just hidden from the user. Let's just use text. And let's set its ID to my text box. And let's set its value to nothing. We won't set that at all. Let's also add a text area element. This is the other way to have textual data within your form. Let's set its ID to my text area. And then inside of the element, let's just say this is a text area. So let's go to the browser and refresh, and we have a poorly formatted form. So let's add some breaking lines so that every element is on its own line. Let's refresh, and that looks a little bit better. Let's first retrieve these text elements. So we will do the same thing that we did with the My Button element. We will use the form object and then use the My Text Box and My Text Area. So let's create a variable called text box. Form.myTextBox and text area equals form.myTextArea. Now, just a few moments ago, I said that I like to keep the event handlers decoupled from the rest of the code. There's times that makes sense to do that, and then there's times that it doesn't. Because we have these element objects already available to us, text box and text areas. And as far as our click event is concerned, these are not the targets of the click event. So I'm going to use text box and text area inside of our click event handler, because the get element by ID method we could use inside of the event handler, but that's like diving into a pool and retrieving the element that we need and then getting back out. So anytime that we clicked on the button, we would have to dive in, get the element, get out. Dive in, get the element, get out. That's a performance hit because we are having to go into the DOM, find the element, and then come back out. Well, since we already have these objects available to us, it makes more sense to use them inside of the click event because we have them in memory. We don't have to go into the DOM and find them because they're already found. So let's get rid of some of this code. We don't want to disable our button anymore. We'll keep our target variable just in case if we want to use that. But let's do some little simple validation. Let's make sure that our text boxes have a value. And if they do have a value, then that's great. If not, then we need to tell the user that they need to input some data inside of one of the text boxes. So let's first validate the text box. So if textbox.value equals an empty string, then we want to alert the user, please input data in box. That's really cryptic, but we are going to make it a little bit easier for the user to understand using visual cues here in a second. So let's also validate the text area. If text area value equals empty string, then alert, please input data in larger box. That's a little bit more descriptive, but once again, we will use visual cues to let the user know where they need to input data. Now, if you'll notice, we are using the value property. That is because the text box is an input element, and all input elements have a value property. So what we learned about buttons are pretty much going to translate to the text boxes as well. The text area element objects also have a value property, which gets the value of the text inside of the box. So let's refresh this, and let's click on the button. We will see an alert box that says please input data in box because our first text box is empty. But as far as the user is concerned, they don't know what box that we need to specify, because we could actually remove the text in our text area. Now they will see two alert boxes, but we could use a visual cue to specify, hey, you need to input data inside of this text box or this text box. So let's do that by using a method that basically every input element has. For text box, we are going to do textbox.focus. This is going to place the focus on this text box. So the focus is wherever the keyboard cursor is, or wherever essentially you click. If I click on this text box, we have given this text box its focus. If we click on the text area, we give the text area focus. If we click on the button, we give the button focus. So let's refresh. And we will see whenever we click the Click Me button, we see the Please Input Data in box. And whenever we click OK, we will see the text area not get focused, or the text box not get focused. Now, why is that? Because I didn't save the JavaScript file. That's kind of important. Okay, so let's refresh. Let's click. And then we see that the text box has focus now. So this is a visual cue that we could give the user to say, hey, this is the text box that you need to input data. So whenever we input data, we can simply now see that there is no alert box displayed, because even though that this is kind of useless information, it passed our validation. Text boxes and text areas also have a method called select. It's going to select all of the text inside of that text box or text area. So let's do that with a text area, because we actually have text there. We simply call text area.select, and let's go back to the browser, refresh, click it, and it selects the text for us. And you can see that it automatically gave that text area focus. So that's another visual cue. If for some reason the text that they entered is invalid, you can use the select method to select that text, which will automatically give it focus, and it's selected, so all the user has to do is start typing. Just like that. We can also disable text boxes by using the disabled property. So let's do text area.disabled equals true. And even though we've disabled the box, we can still use the select method because there's text there to select, and that's all the select method does. So there we go. Now naturally the user cannot modify the contents of this text box because it is disabled, but you can set that through JavaScript. So let's do text area. Value equals just some text. We don't need this call to select. It is unnecessary for this to work. So let's refresh, let's click the button, and we can see that it is both disabled and the text was changed as well. So keep that in mind. Okay, now let's switch gears and let's talk about select elements. And I've already written one because it's a lot of typing. This is going to allow you to select the day of the week, so Sunday through Saturday, and each of these has a value starting at 0 and going to 6. So it's following the same pattern that we use of starting at 0. So let's go ahead and save this, run it in the browser because I actually haven't checked this to see if it works. And there we go. We have our select box Sunday through Saturday. So let's go back to our JavaScript code. Let's get rid of our code for the text area. And let's add a variable for our select box. And I gave that an ID of day of week. So we can do select equals form dot day of week, and that will give us the select element object. Unfortunately, working with select elements isn't as straightforward as other elements. That's going to change with future APIs that are being added as part of HTML5, but not every browser supports those new APIs. And usually whenever I say quote-unquote other browsers, that typically means Internet Explorer. But in this particular case, Internet Explorer is not alone. There's other browsers that do not support these APIs. So we will look at the traditional way of using select element objects, and then we will also look at the new API that's coming down the pipe to make things just a little bit easier. Okay, so with working with select elements, we need two pieces of information. The first is the index of the option that is selected. And I'm going to create a variable called index, and we get that index by using the object followed by selected index. This will give us the index of whatever option is selected. So right now Sunday is selected. If we picked Wednesday, that would give us an index of I'm going to cheat and say 3. And this is kind of a special case because our values correspond with the indexes, but we're not going to worry about that because that's really only typical whenever you start your values at 0, which you're not always going to do. So we're not going to worry about that. But we do have the index now. And so let's say that we have selected Wednesday that has an index of 3. So let me comment that out. So that gives us that piece of information. The next piece is the option object. We have its index, but now we need to get the actual option. So let's create a variable called option. And we are going to use a property of the select element object called options. This is a collection of all of the option elements inside of this particular select element. So Sunday through Saturday is represented here. And since it is a collection, we can kind of use it like an array. It's not an array, but it is an array-like object. So we can use index notation. So we are saying we want to get the option that is at index 3 in this case because we have selected Wednesday. So that's going to give us the option object for Wednesday. So now we can use the option object. It has a value property, and that will give us the value of whatever is specified with our value attribute. Let's change this to Wednesday so that you can see we are actually getting the value and not just the index. So let's refresh. Let's pick Wednesday. Click, and there we go. We have Wednesday. So this is the traditional way of getting the selected option. The new API is a little bit more straightforward, although I think that it could be much more straightforward, but it's an improvement at least, so that's always good. Instead of getting the index and then using the index with the options collection, there will be a property called selected options, and it's plural because a select box can have multiple forms. We are using the drop-down form, which there's only one selected option, but you can have a list box that has multiple options that you can select. So that's why it's plural, because you can have multiple selected options. In our case, we only have one, so we would use the index of 0 because selected options is a collection. So we would specify 0, and then that would give us our selected option. So there, our job is done. But unfortunately, I can't really think of any browser that has this implemented yet. Firefox 11 might. I haven't actually checked. Their documentation says that it is not implemented, but their documentation's old. So Firefox might. I know that Chrome does not. Internet Explorer does not. Opera, who knows, because nobody uses Opera. So this will be useful in the future, but unfortunately we can't use it now. We are stuck using the selected index and then the options and then getting the value. We're not stuck with the options that we've specified in our HTML. We have these, but we can add and remove options as needed. So let's first remove an option. Let's remove Wednesday since that's what we've been working with. And to do that, we simply use the remove method, pass the index that we want to remove, and then that's it. So let's go to the browser, refresh. We can see that Wednesday is listed, but whenever we click on the button, we are going to see the combo box change size because Wednesday is the longest name. And we can also see that Wednesday is no longer in between Tuesday and Thursday. So let's add it back because we kind of do want Wednesday there. Now we do have the Wednesday option in memory because of our code on lines 16 and 17, but let's create a new option. We're going to call this wed option, and we are going to call the option constructor. This is going to create an option object for us. The first argument we pass is the text that we want displayed for our option. The second is the value, 3. So now we just simply need to add it to our select box. Well, one way that we can do that is a lot of typing, and it's really the incorrect way. But if you just want to add an option to the end of the list, you can do select.options and then select.options.length equals the new option. This is adding the option, so whenever we refresh in the browser and we click the button, we can see that Wednesday is added to the end of the list. Now, that's not what we want because we want it in between Tuesday and Thursday. So instead of writing all of this code, we have to write even more code. As it is right now, the index Thursday, or the option Thursday, is at index 3 because we removed Wednesday, which was index 3. And because of that, all of the options reshifted after that particular option. So Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday are all the same as they were. But Thursday, Friday, and Saturday are different because Thursday is now at index 3, Friday at 4, Saturday at 5, Wednesday at 6. So we need to kind of insert Wednesday before Thursday. So we can't do something like select options 3 equals wed option. Or we can, but it's going to replace the Thursday option because Thursday is now at index 3. So instead we use a method called, let me add it there. It's called add. And we first specify the option that we want to add, and then we have to specify the option that we want to add it before. So we don't have a variable for that Thursday, but we do have the options object. So we'll just do that. And whenever we run this code, we will see that Wednesday was added back in between Tuesday and Thursday. So the add method accepts two arguments. The first is the option that we want to insert into our options collection. The second is the options object in our options collection that we want to insert in front of. So we've specified the one at index 3 that at this time is Thursday. So it will insert the Wednesday option in front of Thursday, which will then reorder all of the options after Wednesday. So Wednesday will once again be at index 3, Thursday at 4, Friday at 5, and Saturday at 6. Well, that is a brief little look at how we can use JavaScript with select elements. Let's look at the final two controls, which are checkboxes and radio buttons. And even though they behave differently in the browser, we actually script them almost identically. So let's get rid of our code for our select box. Let's also get rid of the HTML. I'm going to paste in a checkbox. It has a type of checkbox, name of color, value of red, and we will add some other colors later on. But let's first get this element. So let's call this color form.color. And there's really only one property of note with checkboxes and radio buttons. There is the disabled. We can disable any form control, and I didn't mention it with the select element, but we can do the same thing with select elements. But with checkboxes and radio buttons, there is a checked property. It is Boolean. You can give it true or false. True will check the button, false will uncheck it. So let's run this in the browser, and whenever I click the button, we will see the check inside of the checkbox. So that's pretty easy. So let's make things just a little bit more complicated. It's not too much more complicated, but it adds some complexity. I've added two more checkboxes, one for blue and one for green. They all have the same name of color, and that's very important, and I'll tell you why in a second. But they have different values. Of course, one is blue and one is green. Now, since all of these have the same name, we actually, in our code, retrieve all three elements by using form.color. This is going to find all three elements and assign that collection of elements to our color variable. So this is basically an array. We can use it as an array, and then we can determine what checkboxes the user checked by looping over them. So let's get rid of this, and let's use a for loop. So we'll do var I equals 0. And then let's get the length. So we'll do color.length. Let's loop for as long as I is less than L, and then we need to increment, so I plus 1. Now we just need to check for each of the checkboxes checked property. So if color at index I checked, then we want to alert that value. So we will do color I again and then value. Let's save that. Let's also save our HTML file. Let's refresh this in the browser and we see 3 checkboxes, red, blue, and green. Let's check blue and green. So we will see blue and green inside of our alert boxes. If we uncheck blue and do red, we will see red and green. So we can use this same type of pattern if we want to save these actual values inside of another array and then join them into a string. So let's create another variable called picked colors. We'll initialize it as an array, and we'll keep the same basic structure. Instead of calling alert, we will just do picked colors dot push. So we are adding each value that is checked to our picked colors array. And then at the end, let's do alert picked colors dot join. This is going to join all of the elements into an array separated by whatever we specify as the argument to join. So let's save this. Let's refresh in the browser. Let's do red and blue. We will see nothing. That's interesting. Let's look at our JavaScript console, see what we are getting. Unexpected token of an semicolon on line 25. Well, missing a parenthesis. That is a common mistake. Calling a method inside of another method. I always forget to do that for some reason. So let's refresh again. Let's click red and blue. Let's click me. And there we have a string red, comma space, blue. So if we were to pick all of them, then we would have red, comma space, blue, comma space, green. So that is basically how we script checkboxes. Now let's switch these to radio buttons. All we have to do is change the checkbox to radio. We'll keep everything the same, except this is going to change the behavior of how it is within the browser. Instead of being able to check one or all or none, we have to only check at least one. So the code itself is still going to be the same, except now we don't really need an array because there's only one radio button that we can select by clicking on it. So instead of saving all of this to an array, we can just say picked color equals, let's give it an initial value of an empty string. And then we will simply set picked color to whatever value of the radio button that is picked, and then we will simply alert that value. So let's do picked color. Let's refresh this in the browser. Let's pick blue, click me, and then we have the value of blue. We'll do the same thing for green, and so on and so forth. So it's basically the same code, just a tiny little difference because of how radio buttons and checkboxes are used within the browser. And with that, we'll call this lesson done. I am sorry for how long this lesson is. I think I went at least twice over what I usually do. But when talking about forms in JavaScript, there's just a whole lot of information that you have to cover. But at least we did it in one clean stroke. So in the next lesson, we will start looking at AJAX, which is communication between the browser and the server using JavaScript. Have a good one. I will see you next time.